My father asked me to drive him 3 hours into the woods on the second Saturday of October, 2019. He was 79 years old and dying of a lung disease that had spent the last 2 years narrowing his world down to the corner of his living room where his recliner faced the window. He couldn't walk to the mailbox without stopping twice to catch his breath. The oxygen line ran from his nose to a green tank that hissed every time he inhaled. And on a Friday night in early October, while I was sitting at his kitchen table eating a bowl of his soup, he set down his spoon and looked at me across the formica and said there was someone he needed to see one more time before the end. And he needed me to take him. I asked him who. He told me to pack a thermos of coffee and a blanket and to be at his house by 6 in the morning the next day. He told me the drive would take about 3 hours each way and we'd be back before dark. He told me to bring my warm jacket because he wanted to walk a little ways at the other end if his breath would let him. And he told me, in a voice quieter than I'd ever heard from him, that the man he was going to see would already be there waiting when we arrived. He always was. I want to tell you up front what I knew and didn't know that morning when I pulled into his driveway in Katyville, New York, with the sun not yet up over the Saranac River and the temperature reading 34 degrees on the thermometer outside his kitchen window. I knew, because my father had told me when I was 27 years old, that there was something in the woods near a place he wouldn't show on a map. I knew because I had seen it myself once, 29 years earlier, on the only trip I had ever made to that spot with him. I knew the shape of the secret and how heavy it sat on him, and the look on my father's face whenever he came home from one of his solo trips down there, which was the look of a man who had been somewhere most people don't get to go. What I didn't know, what I had let myself forget over almost 3 decades of marriage and work and raising kids and not asking my father about the thing we had agreed without ever discussing it not to discuss, was just how real it was. I had filed it under the category of things my father did, like other men's fathers fished or hunted or tinkered in the garage. I hadn't let it be what it was. Until that Saturday. My name is Calvin Boudreau. I'm 56 years old. I run a small heating and cooling outfit out of Plattsburgh, New York, and I have done so since 1993, servicing oil furnaces and propane boilers and wood stoves that are the only thing standing between an Adirondack family and a bad February. I live in a house my wife Marjorie and I bought in 1994, 3 miles outside of Plattsburgh, with 2 grown kids who are out on their own now, and a dog named Rudy, who is half border collie and half whatever, wandered through the yard. I'm not a hunter. I'm not a particularly outdoorsy man. I work hard, drink a beer on Saturdays, go to the Assumption in Redford at Christmas and Easter, and not much in between. And I have spent my entire adult life within 50 miles of the town I grew up in. My father, Armand Boudreau, was the one who knew the woods. I was the one who stayed near home. Armand had been a saw filer at a small hardwood mill outside Tupper Lake until they shut it down in 1988, and after that he did maintenance work at the paper mill in Plattsburgh until he retired in 2005. He was a French-Canadian kid out of an old Quebec family that had crossed the line into Clinton County in the 1920s to work the iron mines at Lion Mountain and the lumber camps west of there. And he spoke French at home with my grandmother until she died, and he never really learned to be comfortable in a room that didn't have at least one quiet person in it. He was tall and lean, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a face that looked carved out of pine bark, and he had spent every spare weekend of his adult life in the woods west of us, deep into the Adirondack Park. Hunting some, but not mostly. Mostly he just walked. He'd disappear on a Friday afternoon and come back Sunday night with no deer and no fish and no explanation, and my mother, Madeline, would set his plate at the table and ask him no questions. That was how it went for 40 years, until she passed in 2008. After Mom died, his trips got shorter but more frequent. He'd be gone overnight sometimes, 3 days at the most, and he'd come back with that same look. Then, in the spring of 2017, the lung disease started to show, and by the fall of 2018, he couldn't manage the drive on his own anymore, and by the spring of 2019, he was tethered to that oxygen line, and the trips had stopped. I watched him sit by the window and look west, the direction the trips had always taken him, and I knew he was working something out in his head. But I didn't ask, because I had learned a long time ago that my father didn't volunteer what he wasn't ready to say. So when he asked me, that Friday night in October, to drive him one more time, I said yes before I had even thought about it. The yes was waiting in my throat like the question had been waiting in his. I pulled in at 5:55 Saturday morning. He was already on the porch, sitting on the bench with his oxygen tank beside him on a little folding cart he'd rigged up himself, wearing a wool coat over a flannel shirt over a thermal. He had a canvas bag in his lap and 2 spare oxygen cylinders standing by the door. He saw my headlights and stood up slow, holding the porch rail with one hand, and made his way down the 3 steps with a care that hurt to watch. I got out and tried to take the bag, and he gave me a look that meant, "Don't," and I let him carry it himself to the truck. He set it on the floor of the passenger side and lifted the oxygen tank up onto the seat beside it, and then climbed in himself, which took most of a minute, and when he was finally seated with the seatbelt across his chest, he closed his eyes for a long moment and breathed in and out through the cannula and didn't say a word. I loaded the spare tanks behind the seat. I stood with my hand on the door, watching him through the glass, and for the first time, it landed on me that this was probably the last time my father would leave his house under his own power. He was bones inside the coat. The skin on his face had gone the color of old paper. His lips had a faint blue tint that hadn't been there at Christmas. The oxygen tank was reading 2 liters per minute, and his breathing told me it wasn't enough. I got in the cab and started the engine and asked him where I was driving. He told me to head west on Route 3, through Saranac Lake and Tupper Lake and past Cranberry Lake, and after that, he would tell me. I pulled out of his driveway with the heat blowing on his side of the cab and the dark of October still hanging over the Saranac, and we set off down the empty highway with a silence that holds inside it more than it lets out. The drive went west along Route 3 through Old Mill Country, past the dam at Cadyville and the Saranac River running cold beside the road, past the little parish cemetery in Redford, where my great-grandfather and his 3 brothers were buried under granite stones with French inscriptions worn shallow by 90-some Adirondack winters. Past the general store in Clayburgh, where Dad used to stop for a cup of coffee on his way back from the woods. Past the one-room post office in Vermontville, where the postmistress had been the same woman for 40 years until she finally retired the previous spring. He looked out the window at all of it, and I drove, and the heater hissed, and his oxygen hissed under it like a quieter echo, and the sky started to come up gray over the high peaks far to the south. About 40 minutes in, somewhere west of Saranac Lake, he started to talk. He told me he'd been thinking for a long time about how to say what he wanted to say. He told me he was sorry he hadn't said more when I was younger, and sorry he hadn't taken me back to the spot more times after that one trip when I was 27, and sorry that he had let what he knew sit between him and his only son like a closed door, for almost 30 years. I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. He shook his head. He said there was. He said that he had been afraid his whole life, that putting more people inside the secret would damage it, would damage him, would damage me, and that the man we were driving to see, the man who would already be waiting when we got there, deserved better than to have his existence kept from the world by a frightened mill hand from Cadyville who didn't know how to talk to his own son. He stopped to breathe for a while after that. I let the silence hold. We passed through Bloomingdale, and the trees got thicker and the houses got farther apart. The sky stayed gray. A few maples along the shoulder still held their last copper leaves, and the wind off the road kept pulling them down in twos and threes, and they spun in the truck's wake and disappeared in the rear view. Dad watched them go without saying anything. I had the heat blowing on his side and the radio off, and I had not eaten breakfast, and my stomach was tight in a way I had not felt since the morning my mother died. He started again somewhere west of Tupper Lake. He said he wanted to tell me how it began for him, in case I'd forgotten the version he'd given me when I was 27, and in case some details had shifted over the years. He said he had first walked into that part of the woods in October of 1968, when he was 28 years old, and that the man we were driving to see had been there waiting for him then too, although neither of them had known it at the time. In '68, he said, he had been working at the mill and was on a long weekend off. He had driven west to a stretch of Forest Service road in the Five Ponds Wilderness, parked his truck at a turnaround, and walked in along an old skidder track that had been growing back since the loggers had pulled out in the '50s. He was looking for a place to deer hunt the following month. He wanted to scout the country alone, with no companions, because he had grown up in a house full of men who all hunted together, and he wanted, for once, to find a piece of country that was his. He walked for about 3 hours, climbing a long slope and then dropping into a hollow on the far side, until he came to a creek that wasn't on his map. He followed it upstream half a mile to a place where the water came out of a crack in a slab of bedrock and pooled in a shallow basin before running on. He sat down on a fallen hemlock to eat his sandwich, and that was where he was when he first heard the breathing. He told me he heard it before he saw anything, a breathing that wasn't his. Slower than his, deeper, coming from somewhere behind him in the timber. He said his first thought was bear, and his second thought was that it was the wrong kind of breathing for a bear, and his third thought was that he didn't know what kind of breathing it was, and that uncertainty was the most frightening thing he'd ever felt in his life. He sat very still on the log with the half-eaten sandwich in his hand, and he didn't turn around. He waited. The breathing didn't come closer. It didn't go away. It just stayed where it was, somewhere up the slope behind him, for what he estimated as 20 or 25 minutes. And then, slowly, it moved off uphill and was gone. He didn't see anything that day. He walked back to his truck, shaken in a way he didn't have words for, and he drove home, and he didn't tell my mother. He thought about it all week. The next weekend, he went back. He brought a sandwich and a thermos, and he sat on the same log and he waited. And around mid-afternoon, the breathing came again. Same place, same depth. Closer this time, he thought. He still didn't turn around. He sat. It stayed for nearly an hour. Then it left. 3 weekends in a row, he did this. By the fourth, he had started leaving things on a flat rock near the spring before he sat down. A piece of dried venison, an apple, a wedge of his mother's tourtière, the meat pie she made every fall from a recipe she had carried south out of Quebec when she was a young woman. And the only thing he could think to bring that his mother had made with her own hands. The first time, the offerings were still on the rock when he came back the next week. The second time, only the apple was gone. The third time, the rock was clean. That was when he turned around. He told me he turned slow, like a man turning when he's trying not to spook a deer at 20 yards. He started by tilting his head, then by shifting his shoulders, then by moving his hips, until eventually he was facing uphill toward the timber where the breathing had been. The breathing wasn't there that day, but about 60 yards up the slope, between two big hemlocks, something was standing. It was taller than any man he'd ever seen, broad through the shoulders so much that the hemlocks beside it looked thin, covered in dark hair that the late autumn light made look almost black except where the gray came through at the chest and the temples. Dad said the face was hard to see at that distance, but the eyes caught the light, and what came back at him from the eyes was a level of attention he had never received from anything before in his life. They stood like that for a long time. Eventually, my father said, he raised one hand, not a wave, just a flat palm held out, like you'd show an empty hand to someone who needed to know you weren't carrying a weapon. He held it for maybe 10 seconds. Then he lowered it. The thing on the slope didn't move. It didn't acknowledge him with any gesture he could read, but it didn't run either. After another minute or two, it turned, slow, and walked uphill into the timber, and the timber took it, and that was that. My father went back the next weekend, and the weekend after, and every weekend that fall, and most weekends through the winter, and every weekend the following spring. By the summer of 1969, he had been to that spring more than 30 times, and he had seen the figure on the slope 11 times by his count, always at distance, always silent, and the offerings he left on the rock were always gone by the next visit. By the fall of 1969, the figure had moved closer. By the winter, it had come within 40 yards of the rock while my father was still sitting on the log, and my father had spoken to him for the first time in a normal speaking voice, and said hello, and the figure had stayed where he was and made a sound, low in his chest, that my father said felt like the answer to the question he hadn't asked. That, my father said, was when he started calling him Vieux in his own head. It's a French word. Means old man, like what a child might call a grandfather, but with a respect built into it that doesn't come through in English. Dad said he never spoke the name out loud at the spring for years. It was just what he thought of him as. The old one at the spring. Vieux. The drive west continued. We crossed into St. Lawrence County, and the forest got bigger, and the towns got smaller and farther apart. Dad kept talking when his lungs would let him, and stopped when they wouldn't. He told me about the years that followed '69. Through the '70s, while he was working full-time at the mill and raising me and my sister Genevieve. Through the '80s, when the lumber market crashed and times got hard and the trips to the spring became the one steady thing in his life. Through the '90s, after the mill closed, when he picked up the work at the paper plant and kept driving west on weekends with a thermos and a canvas bag full of food. He told me that for 51 years he had gone to that spring, and that for 51 years Vieux had come to meet him. Sometimes from a distance, sometimes close enough to see the lines around his eyes. They never touched. Vieux never spoke a word. But my father said the two of them had worked out a way of being together that taught him more about what it meant to be alive than any human conversation ever had. We were about 2 hours into the drive when he told me about the year he had brought me, 1990. I was 27 and newly married to Marjorie. Dad had asked me to come down to the woods with him for a long weekend, and I had said yes because I thought he wanted to fish, and we had driven the same route I was driving now, and he had sat me down on a stump near that spring and told me that there was a man who would be coming, and that the man wasn't a man, and that I needed to sit still and look and listen and not be afraid. And when Vieux had come out of the timber that afternoon and stood across the clearing from us, 50 yards away, and looked at me, with his head slightly tilted, I had been afraid. I had been so afraid that my father had needed to put a hand on my shoulder to keep me from standing up. But I hadn't run. I had sat. I had looked. And eventually, Vieux had made his low chest sound and turned and walked away, and my father had said, "That's enough for today." And we had walked back to the truck together in silence. That night in the motel in Cranberry Lake, my father had sat across the table from me and said only one thing about it. He had said, "You saw him. You can decide what you want to do with that. I'm not going to ask you to come back. I'm not going to ask you to tell anyone. I'm not going to ask you anything. What you do with it is yours." I had not gone back. Marjorie had been pregnant with our first that fall, and my customers had needed me, and my life had filled up with the things lives fill up with, and the truth, which I am ashamed of now in a way I wasn't ashamed of then, is that I let myself forget. I had kept the memory of Vieux in a back room of my head, a room I rarely visited, and over the years, that room had gotten dusty, and the figure inside it had become, in my mind, more like a story my father had told me than something I had seen with my own eyes. I told my father, in the cab of my truck on the morning of October 12th, 2019, that I was sorry I had done that I had let his life with Vieux become a story I told myself wasn't quite real, because that was easier than letting it be real. He shook his head. He said he understood. He said he'd watched me make my choice in 1990, and he had respected it then. And he respected it now, because the spring belonged to whoever could carry it, and not everybody can carry a spring. He said carrying is heavier than people think. He said he was glad now to set it down for a while, in front of someone, before he set it down for good. He told me then what I would see when we got there. He said Vieux would already be at the rock. He'd be sitting, or standing close to the rock with his hand on it, like he had stood close to the rock for as long as Dad had known him. Dad said that for the last 3 years, since the lungs started, he had been driving down less and less often, and the last visit had been in May. He had told Vieux that last visit in his head and out loud that he was sick and that he didn't know how many more times he could come. He said Vieux had reached into a cleft in the rock and brought out a small carved object made of bone and laid it on the flat. A bird, Dad said, carved from the leg bone of a deer, crude but recognizable, wings spread. Dad had taken it home with him. It was in the canvas bag in the footwell of the truck. I asked him what the bird was for. He said he thought it was Vieux's way of saying, "When you don't come back, this will be how I remember you." He said he had been carrying it in his pocket since May, and he hadn't been able to look at it without feeling like he had failed. He said he was bringing it back today. He said he wanted Vieux to have it for whoever came next. He looked at me when he said that. He said, "If anyone is going to come next, it'll have to be you." He didn't push it. He just laid it down between us in the cab the same way he had laid the apple on the rock 51 years before, and let me decide whether to pick it up or not. He fell asleep around the 3-hour mark, a few miles past Cranberry Lake, where the road thinned out into forest service track and the maples crowded close to the gravel shoulders. I drove with one eye on him and one eye on the road. The cannula was making its soft, hissing sound. The skin around his lips had gone bluer. I watched his chest rise and fall and counted his breaths, and they were coming faster than they should have. And I knew, in the cab of that truck on that gravel road, that the disease was further along than he had let on to me or the doctors or himself. He woke up when I turned onto the spur road he had described, a two-track that ran south off the main forest road and was barely passable with anything less than four-wheel drive. He sat up and looked out the window, and a small smile came onto his face. He said, "The maples have not changed." I asked him where to park. He pointed to a wide spot in the road, maybe a quarter-mile in, where there was a fallen log laid lengthwise as a kind of natural marker. I pulled the truck up to the log and shut off the engine, and the silence rushed in. The Adirondacks in October are a particular kind of quiet. The leaves are mostly down by the second week. The ground is covered in red and orange and brown. The sky is gray more often than not. The air carries the smell of wet wood and decay, and the faint, sweet rot of old apples, wherever there used to be a homestead. The temperature was in the low 40s by then, the sun trying to break through a thin overcast and not quite making it. The maples Dad had recognized were gray-trunked sugar maples, 60 and 70 feet tall, their crowns thinned by season and age, their roots pushing up through the duff in places like ribs. Beneath them, the understory was hemlock and yellow birch and a scattering of striped maple. The road petered out about 30 yards beyond where I'd parked, and from there, a footpath, narrow but visible, ran south through the trees toward a slope. I helped him out of the truck. He couldn't manage the oxygen tank and the canvas bag and his own weight, so I shouldered the tank on its little cart by its handle and carried the bag in my other hand and let him use both his hands on a walking stick he had brought in the truck bed, a piece of black ash he had cut and shaped himself 30 years before. He took the path slow, 20 steps, and he had to stop. 20 more, another stop. The sound of his breathing through the cannula was the loudest thing in the woods. We made our way down the slope I had walked once before, 29 years earlier, through hemlock and yellow birch, over roots and rocks, and every step he took seemed to come from somewhere deeper in him than he had left to give. It took us 45 minutes to cover what couldn't have been more than a quarter mile. He stopped, finally, at the lip of a small hollow, where the path bent left around a granite outcrop and the ground dropped 20 feet to a flat clearing below. He held onto the outcrop with one hand and looked down into the hollow. I looked, too. The spring was there, just as he had described it. A crack in a slab of bedrock, water seeping out and pooling in a basin maybe 4 feet across before running off downhill. A flat rock beside the basin, the size of a kitchen table, gray and weathered and clean. A fallen hemlock at the edge of the clearing, the same one, my father whispered, that he had been sitting on in October of 1968. The clearing was littered with fallen leaves. The water of the spring caught the gray light and gave it back silver. And on the far side of the spring, with one massive hand resting flat on the surface of the rock, stood Vieux. He was already there, just like my father had said, standing as still as the trees behind him, head turned toward the path we were standing on, eyes, and I could see them clearly even at the distance, which was maybe 40 feet, waiting. I want to try to describe him to you, because the version of him in my head from 29 years before had thinned out into a vague, tall shape in a memory I had not fed, and the version standing in front of me now was nothing like that. He was a person. That hit me before anything else did. He stood maybe 8 feet tall, broad through the chest like a man who has carried weight his whole life, with a head set forward of his shoulders the way a heavy bull stands. His hair was long and dark, almost charcoal at the body, but it had gone silver at the temples and along the jaw and across the chest. His face had structure to it. The brow was heavy, but the eyes beneath it were set deep and wide-spaced and clear. Eyes that had been watching weather and animals and seasons for longer than most people live. He had the face of a man who had wintered in the open for 60 or 70 years and was still here. His whole body was turned toward my father like a compass needle turning toward north. He didn't move when he saw us. I think he had heard us long before we came into view. My father's labored breathing on the slope, the hiss of the cannula, the rhythm of stops and starts. He knew who was coming. He had put himself at the rock so my father wouldn't have to go looking for him. My father's hand was shaking on the walking stick. He started down the slope into the hollow, slow, picking his way through the rocks and the roots, and I scrambled up off the granite outcrop and followed with the tank cart, trying to keep him from falling. Vieux did not move. He watched my father descend. When we reached the flat clearing at the bottom and crossed the leaves toward the rock, Vieux took his hand off the stone and lowered it to his side. He did not step forward. He let my father come to him. He waited like a man waiting for an old friend at the end of a long platform, like you wait when you don't want to rush something that is finally happening. My father stopped about 10 feet from him. He set the walking stick down carefully. He took a breath that I could hear hit a wall somewhere in his chest, and then pushed past the wall with effort. And then, without saying anything, he reached his right hand into the canvas bag I was holding, and he brought out the bone bird carved from the deer leg, and he held it up so that Vieux could see it. The carved wings caught the gray light. My father's hand was trembling, but he held the bird steady. Vieux looked at the bird. Then he looked at my father. Then he looked at me. He looked at me like a man looking at a question he has been waiting a long time to ask. His eyes weren't hostile. They were considering. I could feel them go through me, weighing whatever they found. And I understood, sitting there in the leaves of a 5-ponds wilderness hollow on the second Saturday of October, that I had been seen completely by something that had been waiting almost 3 decades to see me again, and that whatever happened next in that clearing would depend partly on what he found when he looked. My father, behind me, said in a voice that was barely there, "This is my son." He came back. Vieux's eyes moved from me back to my father. Something passed across his face I could not name. Recognition, maybe, or relief, or something older and quieter than either of those words. He let out a long, low breath that I felt more than heard, a vibration that went through the leaves and the air between us and settled in my chest like a hand laid flat. Then he raised his right arm, slow, and held it palm out toward my father. The same gesture my father had told me he had given Vieux 51 years before from 60 yards up the slope. The gesture that meant nothing in my hand. The gesture that had started everything. My father raised his own hand back. The bone bird was still in his fingers. The two of them stood there, palms out, 10 feet apart, and I sat in the leaves and watched 2 old men greet each other across a hollow in a forest neither of them owned, but both of them belonged to. And I understood for the first time in my life with a clarity you only get a few times if you are lucky, that I had not just driven my dying father 3 hours to say goodbye to a friend. I had driven him to be handed over from one keeper to another. And the question Vieux was asking with his eyes, when he looked at me, was whether I would take what my father was about to set down. I didn't have an answer yet. I sat in the leaves with my hands in the cold dirt and my father's oxygen tank hissing beside me, and I watched the two of them. And I felt 51 years lower itself into the clearing and wait for me to decide. My father broke the moment by lowering his hand and taking a step forward. It was the wrong step for his lungs. I saw him sway, saw the color drain from his face, saw the walking stick start to slip out from under his weight. I started to scramble up. Before I had gotten my feet under me, Vieux had crossed the distance between them. He moved fast, faster than my eye could quite follow. One moment, he was 10 feet away with his hand out. The next moment, he was beside my father with one massive arm under my father's elbow and the other across his back, holding him up. He did it carefully. He did it like you would lift a baby bird off the ground, which is to say with all the strength held in reserve and nothing but the necessary amount used. My father's whole body would have fit inside the span of one of his hands. The hand on my father's back covered him from shoulder to hip. My father didn't startle. He didn't pull away. He let himself be held. His head tipped sideways and rested for a second against the side of Vieux's chest, and Vieux held him there, and I sat in the leaves and watched my father be carried by his weight against the body of something that was, in that moment, the only thing standing between Armand Boudreau and the cold ground. I will tell you that the strangest part was how unsurprising it looked. Two old men, one propping up the other. A scene you would see in any kitchen in any farmhouse in Clinton County after one of them had had a hard day and the other one had walked over to help. The size difference fell away. The hair fell away. The strangeness fell away. What was left was just two beings who had known each other for 51 years, and one of them was failing, and the other one was not going to let him fall. Vieux helped him over to the flat rock. He lowered him onto it with that same careful slowness, supporting him the whole way. My father sat down on the rock and put one hand flat against its surface to steady himself. Vieux stayed close, not touching now, but close enough that if my father started to tip again, he could catch him. The big hand stayed at arm's reach. I scrambled up with the oxygen tank and brought it around. My father's lungs were laboring. I cranked the regulator up from 2 liters to 3, then to 4, watching the dial. Dad waved a hand at me to slow down. I sat on my heels beside him on the rock and watched his color come back, slow, over the next several minutes. Vieux stood beside us the whole time. His eyes never left my father's face. When my father's breathing evened out, Vieux let out another of his low chest sounds, a vibration more than a noise, and my father reached up with his free hand and laid it briefly on the back of Vieux's wrist, where the silver hair met skin darker than I had expected. The first time, my father told me later, that the two of them had ever touched each other in 51 years. I will tell you what I felt then, because I want to be honest about it. I had grown up in a house with a father who did not touch me much. He was not a cruel man. He was just from a place and a time and a French-Canadian family where men did not put their hands on each other except to shake hands or to drag a dead deer out of the woods. I had watched my father go 56 years without resting his hand on anyone in front of me except my mother, and watching him lay his hand on the wrist of the old hominid in the hollow, with that much trust in the gesture, broke something open in my chest that I had not known was closed. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times in my mind in the years since. My father's pale fingers resting on the silver hair at Vieux's wrist, the hiss of the cannula, the gray light coming down through the maples. Vieux's eyes closing for one long second when my father's hand made contact, the way a horse closes its eyes when someone who knows its name speaks it soft. My father's mouth shaping a word I couldn't hear. That word, he told me later, was mercy, French for thank you. After that, my father just sat on the rock for a long time. Vieux stayed beside him. I sat at the base of the rock with my back against it. None of us spoke. The water at the spring kept up its small sound. A nuthatch called somewhere in the hemlocks. The light moved through the canopy. After maybe half an hour, my father reached into his coat pocket and brought out something I hadn't known he was carrying. A small, soft cloth bundle. He unfolded it on his lap. Inside was a single piece of smoked whitefish, cured and wrapped, from a smoker my father had built behind his garage in 1976. He had been smoking whitefish in that smoker for 43 years. He had brought one piece. He held it up to Vieux. Vieux bent down slowly and took it from my father's hand, his fingers somehow managing not to crush my father's, and he ate the fish in 2 careful bites, chewing with his mouth closed, his eyes on my father's the whole time. When he was done, he made the chest sound again. My father laughed, a real laugh, small and breathless and full of something I hadn't heard come out of him in months. He said, in English, "You always liked that one." Vieux's eyes crinkled at the edges. I would swear, and I will swear if anybody asks, that it was a smile. Let me walk you through what was in the canvas bag, because I learned more sitting on that rock than I learned in any other 40 minutes of my life. And most of what I learned came out of that bag, a piece at a time. There was the smoked whitefish, which he had already given. There was a small wool blanket, the gray and red one from the back of my mother's couch, the one she had crocheted in the 70s, and that had sat folded on Armand's recliner for the 11 years since she had died. My father took it out and laid it across his own knees first, just resting it there, and Vieux looked at the blanket and made a soft sound. Dad said to him, "This was Madeline's." He said her name out loud, slow, like you might introduce someone. He spread the blanket on the rock between them, and Vieux reached out one finger, just the index finger of his right hand, and ran it along the edge of the wool. Then he pulled his hand back. He let her stay on the rock between them. Then there was a small leather pouch with 3 smooth river stones in it that my father had been picking up from the spring on his visits over the years. One every dozen visits or so, when something about the day made him want to take a piece of it home. He laid all 3 of them in a row on the rock. He told me afterward that he was bringing them back. He had decided in the spring, when his lungs first started to fail, that whatever he had carried out of the hollow over 51 years should go back, except for one thing, and the one thing turned out to be the bone bird. And now even that was going back. He laid the 3 river stones down, and Vieux looked at each one and made his low sound. And I had the strange certainty that he recognized which ones they were and remembered the days they had been picked up. Then there was a folded photograph, the only one Dad had ever brought down. I had not known he was bringing it. He took it out and unfolded it and laid it on the rock. It was a black and white picture of him and my mother on their wedding day at St. Alphonsus in Tupper Lake, June of 1962. My father in a borrowed suit, and my mother in a dress her own mother had made from cotton flour sacks, bleached white. They were standing on the church steps. They were both maybe 22 years old. They looked like they did not know what was coming and were not afraid of it. Dad said to Vieux, "This is Madeleine. This is the one I told you about." Vieux studied the photograph for a long time. He bent his head close to it. His breath fogged the surface of the print and pulled back. He looked from the picture to my father's face and back again, and then he made a sound I had not heard him make yet. A short, descending hum. 3 quick, falling tones. My father's eyes filled up. He told me later that the sound had a meaning he had learned to recognize over 51 years. It meant, I see her. I know she's gone. I am sorry. He had been carrying my mother's death for 11 years, and he had never, in those 11 years, told anybody about it the way I think he told it to Vieux in those 3 falling tones. My father had not cried at her funeral. He had not cried at any of the anniversaries. But he sat on that rock in the hollow on October the 12th and let his face go wet over a photograph from 1962 while a being most of the world doesn't believe in made a sound that meant condolence. And I sat at the base of the rock and watched it. And I understood that my father had been holding things back for most of his adult life, that he had only ever sat down in this clearing, in front of this listener, on these visits. He folded the photograph and put it back in the bag. The wool blanket went next, folded careful, my father smoothing the edges with his thin hands. The river stones stayed on the rock. That was when my father reached for the bone bird again. He held it up between them. He said, "This came back to me. I'm bringing it back." He laid the bird on the rock beside him. Vieux looked at the bird for a long time. Then he reached past my father, slow, and I felt him brush by me on his way around, and the heat coming off his body was startling, like standing too close to a wood stove. He moved to the cleft in the bedrock that my father had described to me on the drive, the same cleft where he had pulled out the bird in May. He reached his hand into the cleft, deeper than I would have thought possible, and brought out something else. It was a piece of birch bark, white and curling, about the size of a dinner plate. It had marks on it. He laid the bark on the rock beside my father's bone bird. I leaned in to look. The marks were dark, ground in with what looked like charcoal mixed with something else. There were rows of them, lines of small notches, grouped in 5s, with longer slashes between them. There must have been 300 marks on the bark, maybe more. I didn't understand what I was looking at until my father, beside me, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He said, "Those are visits." He counted them. I watched him count them, his finger moving along the bark, his lips making the numbers in French under his breath. The total he came up with, when he was done, was something like 410. He said, "He kept count. He kept count of every time I came down here. 51 years. He kept count." I sat on the rock with my dying father, and I looked at the piece of birch bark with 410 notches scratched into it by something that supposedly didn't exist. And I understood that I was looking at a record. Vieux had kept account of his friendship with my father. He had laid it down on the rock now because the friendship was ending, and he wanted my father to see what it had added up to. My father rested both his hands on the bark. He bent his head over it for a long time. I think he was crying, but I'm not certain, because I was not really looking at his face. I was looking at Vieux, who was standing on the other side of the rock with his eyes closed, head bowed, the way I had seen old men stand at the front of a Catholic church when the casket goes by. After a long while, my father raised his head. He told Vieux in English that the bird was for him to keep. He picked it up off the rock and held it out, and Vieux reached his big hand around it and took it. Dad said, "You keep it. You made it. I'm done carrying things." Then he reached for the birch bark and folded it in half carefully and tucked it into the canvas bag at my feet. He looked at me when he did it. He said, This comes home with us. This is the proof. Not that anybody needs proof, but it's the proof anyway. He was getting weaker. I could see it. The trip in had cost him more than he had expected, and the cold of the rock under him was working into his joints, and the oxygen at 4 liters was barely keeping his lips from going blue again. I told him quietly that we needed to start back. He nodded, but he didn't move. He looked up at Vieux. He said, "I'm not coming back. I think you know." Vieux didn't move. He stood there with the bone bird in his hand, looking down at my father. Dad said, "My son will come, if he can. I'm leaving him this. I'm leaving him you. He's a good man. He'll figure it out." Vieux's eyes shifted to me. They held me a long moment. I held them back. I felt, sitting on that flat rock with my father's hand on my shoulder and the cold of October coming up through my jeans, that something was being asked of me without words, and that an answer was being expected. I nodded at him. Just once. The way you nod at a man across a room you've never met, but whose name you've known your whole life. Vieux nodded back. It is a small thing to write down on paper. I want to be careful with how I describe it, because the gesture itself was so small, and so much depended on it. He moved his head once, down and up. Slow. The motion of a man saying yes to a question he has been waiting a long time to be asked. And in the moment that he did it, I understood that everything my father had built over 51 years of weekends, the spring, the rock, the bone bird, the birch bark, all of it, was being handed over, from one keeper to another, in a wordless ceremony in a forest hollow in St. Lawrence County, New York. I had agreed to keep it. Vieux had agreed to keep it with me. My father reached up and squeezed my shoulder hard enough to hurt. He whispered, "Merci," the word he had said earlier. "Thank you." He said it to me this time. I helped him stand. His knees didn't want to work. Vieux stepped around the rock and put his hand under my father's elbow again and helped me get him up. The 3 of us stood in the hollow for a moment, and then Vieux did something else I have not been able to forget. He bent down very low so that his face was at the level of my father's face, and he placed his big forehead against my father's small one, and he held it there for the count of about 5 seconds. He breathed out through his nose, slow. My father closed his eyes. When Vieux straightened back up, my father's whole face had gone wet, and Vieux's eyes were shining in a way I had not understood eyes like his could shine. Then Vieux stepped back. He turned and looked across the spring and made a long, low call up into the timber. The call my father had described, 2.5 octaves, and held at the top for a full breath. I had never heard a sound like it. It went up the slope and into the hemlocks, and seemed to go on into the country beyond, long after the call itself had ended. Then he turned back and looked at us. He didn't move. He was waiting for us to leave first. I got my father started up the slope. He could not have made it without me. I had the canvas bag in one hand and the oxygen tank cart in the other, and his elbow under my arm, and we went up the path one step at a time, with him stopping every 6 or 7 steps to lean on a tree and find his breath. It took us close to an hour to climb back to the truck. When I got him up over the lip of the hollow and looked back, Vieux was still standing by the rock, his hand on the stone, watching us go. He did not move the entire time. The last I saw of him, he raised his palm one last time, the way my father had raised his 51 years before. I raised mine back. It was the first time I had done it. We made it to the truck. I got him inside and turned the heat on full and got the oxygen settled and the seatbelt across him. And I sat behind the wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. He had his eyes closed. His breathing was wrong. His lips were the color of slate. I thought for a moment that I was going to lose him there in the cab, in the wide spot in the road where the fallen log lay. I started the engine and turned the truck around and drove out the way we had come in, slow, holding it under 20 until we hit the gravel, and then carefully easing up to 40 as the road improved. I called Marjorie from a high spot on the main road where I had 1 bar of signal. I told her I was driving Dad to the hospital in Plattsburgh, and we'd be there in 3 hours, and could she meet me? She didn't ask questions. She said yes and hung up. He didn't open his eyes for the first hour of the drive home. I kept reaching over to feel for his pulse at his wrist. It was there, but it was thready. The cannula hissed. I drove with one hand and held his wrist with the other when I could. Around the time we passed back through Tupper Lake, he opened his eyes and looked at me. He said, "I want to go home, not the hospital." I said, "Dad, your lungs." He said, "I went today. I did what I came to do. I want to die in my own bed." He said it without drama. He said it like he would have said, "Pass me the salt." And I understood, driving east up Route 3 in the gray afternoon of October the 12th, 2019, that my father had spent everything he had on that visit to the spring, and that the ride home was the ride home in every sense, that meant anything, and that the hospital in Plattsburgh was not where he was going to spend the last of his time. I called Marjorie back. I told her change of plans. I told her to meet me at Dad's house and to call hospice and to call Father Bissett, even though Dad hadn't been to Mass in 5 years. She asked me what had happened down there. I told her I would tell her later. She didn't push. We drove the rest of the way in silence. Dad slept most of it. I stopped twice at gas stations to check on him. Both times he opened his eyes when I touched his wrist and gave me a small smile and closed them again. The bone bird was no longer in the canvas bag. The birch bark was. I drove with the bag on the seat between us where the carved bird had been on the way down. We pulled into his driveway in Katyville at 6:12 in the evening. Marjorie was on the porch. The hospice nurse was inside making the bed. Father Bissett from the Assumption was on his way. Marjorie met me at the truck and looked at my father and looked at me and asked if she could help carry him in. I said yes. The two of us got him out of the cab and up the porch steps and inside, and we got him into the hospital bed in the living room that hospice had set up months before, the one he had been refusing to use, and he sank into it like he was sinking into the bottom of a pond, and his eyes closed and his breath was shallow, but it was breath, and he was home. He lasted 4 more days. He did not get out of that bed again. The hospice nurse kept him comfortable. Father Bissett came on Sunday and gave him last rites, and Dad held his hand and said in French that he was ready. And Father Bissett, who didn't speak French, nodded as if he had understood, because that's what Father Bissett did. My sister Genevieve flew in from Montreal on Sunday night. The grandkids came on Monday. We all sat with him in shifts. Marjorie made coffee. The nurse changed the oxygen tank twice a day. The neighbors brought casseroles I couldn't bring myself to eat. On Tuesday afternoon, when it was just the two of us in the room, he opened his eyes and looked at me and said, "Did you see how he looked at the fish?" I said, "I saw." He said, "He liked the fish." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "You'll keep going down there." I said, "I'll go." He said, "You don't have to go every weekend. He understands seasons. He understands lives. Just don't let him think you forgot." I said, "I won't let him think that." He closed his eyes again and didn't open them. He breathed slower and slower through Tuesday night. He was gone by 4 in the morning on Wednesday, October 16th, 2019, with my hand around his and Genevieve's hand on his forehead, and Marjorie asleep in the chair behind us. The hospice nurse came in and put her stethoscope on his chest and said he was at peace, and we should take whatever time we needed. We sat with him for about an hour. Then we let him go. The funeral was on Saturday at the Church of the Assumption in Redford. The church was full. The Boudreau family on his side, and the LaFontaine family on my mother's side, and most of the old men he had worked with at the mill and at the paper plant. Father Bissett said the things priests say. We buried him in the parish cemetery beside my mother. Genevieve flew home Tuesday. I went back to work on Wednesday. The world did what the world does after a death, which is to absorb the empty space and keep moving. I went down to the spring 3 weeks later, the second weekend in November. The maples were all bare by then. The first dusting of snow had come and gone. I drove the route my father had taught me, 3 hours each way, parked at the wide spot in the road, walked down through the hemlock and yellow birch with a thermos and a canvas bag of my own, and my father's walking stick in my hand. I had brought a piece of smoked whitefish from a man in Saranac Lake who still smokes lake fish the old way in an oil drum smoker behind his house. I had brought a thermos of coffee. I had brought the birch bark with the 410 notches. And I had brought a knife. Vieux was at the rock when I came down the path. He had been waiting. I don't know how he knew I was coming. I had not told him I was coming. I had not even told myself until I got in the truck that morning that I was going. But he was there, standing the same way he had stood for my father, hand on the stone. I came down into the hollow alone. The slope felt longer without my father beside me, and shorter than it had felt 3 weeks earlier when I had been bracing him under one arm. Halfway down, my legs almost gave out, and I had to sit on a root for a minute and put my head between my knees. I had cried twice already that morning, once at 6 when I pulled out of my driveway, and once around mile 80 when a deer crossed the road in front of me. And I thought of the venison Dad had laid on the rock in 1968. I thought maybe I was going to cry a third time on the slope, but I didn't. Something about knowing he was waiting at the bottom held me together. I crossed to the rock. He watched me come. When I reached the rock, I laid out the things I had brought: the whitefish on the cloth, the birch bark with the count, the thermos of coffee opened, 2 cups, one for him and one for me. I had also brought in my coat pocket a small object I had been turning over in my hand for the entire drive down. It was a brass mill badge, Adirondack Hardwoods, employee number 497. My father had been issued that badge in 1972 and had carried it on his person every day at work for 16 years until the mill shut down. He had worn it pinned to the inside of every work shirt he owned. After he retired, he had kept it in a small dish on his dresser. After he died, I had taken it. I did not know what I was going to do with it on the drive down. I knew when I sat down at the rock. I held the badge up between us. I said, "This was his." Vieux looked at the badge. He took it from my fingers, careful like he had been careful with the fish. He turned it over in his hand. The brass caught the gray light. He held it for a long minute. Then he reached around the side of the rock and pressed the badge into a crack in the bedrock, deep, until it was wedged in tight, and only the top edge with the number stamped on it was still visible. He turned to me and made his low chest sound. Then he laid one big hand on the stone over the place where the badge was wedged. He kept it there a long time. I understood that I had just helped Vieux do something. I had brought him a piece of my father to keep. He had put it where it would stay. The crack in the bedrock had become my father's marker in the only cemetery that mattered to either of them. He took the fish in his big, careful hand and ate it. He drank the coffee in one swallow from the cup I poured. He looked at the birch bark for a long time. Then he reached out, very slow, and pushed the bark back toward me. He didn't want it back. It was mine to keep. It was the record of what had passed between him and my father, and now it was a record I was inheriting. I added a notch to it that day with my knife after I had sat with him for an hour in the gray cold, drinking coffee and not speaking. One small mark on the lower right edge where my father's count had ended. Visit 411, the first one in my hand. When I stood to leave, he stood with me. He came around the rock. I expected him to stay where he was. He didn't. He walked me partway up the slope, the way you walk a guest to the door, 20 yards behind me, but matched to my pace. And he stopped at the lip of the hollow and watched me go the rest of the way alone. When I turned at the top to look back, he raised his hand. I raised mine. We held the gesture for a few seconds. Then I walked to the truck, and he turned and went back down to the rock. The drive home that first time was the longest I have ever made. I cried somewhere west of Cranberry Lake, and I cried again coming up over the bridge at Tupper Lake, and I pulled over once at a turnout outside Saranac Lake and sat with the engine running and tried to put words to what had just happened, and I couldn't. And so I drove the rest of the way home in a silence that felt the same as the silence in the truck on the way down with my father. Only now I was the one carrying it. That was 5 years ago. The bark in my desk drawer at home now has 58 notches added to my father's 410. I have gone every month I could manage, every season, every year. Some weekends I see him for 2 hours. Some weekends I sit at the rock alone for the whole afternoon, and he doesn't come. And I leave food anyway, and the food is gone the next time. He is older than my father was when my father died. I don't know how much longer he will be at the rock when I come down the slope. I think about that a lot. I think about whether I will be there for Vieux at the end, the way he was there for my father. I hope I will. I am 61 now. My oldest grandson is 12. He looks like Armand. He has my father's hands and my father's eyes, and my father's quiet way of watching things before he speaks. And he asks me sometimes about Grandpa, and I tell him stories. I have not told him about the spring. I will when he's older, when the right age finds him. The same way the right age found me twice, once at 27 when I wasn't grown enough yet, and once at 56 when I had no choice. I will give him the bark. I will tell him about Vieux. I will let him decide whether to carry the spring or set it down. The same way my father let me decide. The same way Vieux let me decide. Before I'm done, I need to say what I think the trip on October the 12th, 2019, was actually about. I thought, the morning I drove west out of Cadyville with my father and his oxygen tank in the cab beside me, that I was driving him to a goodbye. I thought my father had a friend in the woods, and the friend was going to be there, and they would have their last visit, and we would drive home. That was the size of the thing in my head. That was the shape I had given it. What I learned, sitting on the leaves in the hollow with my hands cold in the dirt, was that I had the size wrong. What was waiting for us at the rock was not just a goodbye, it was a transfer. My father had spent 51 years building a friendship with a being most people don't believe in, and he had done it alone in silence, on weekends, with his own hands and his own quiet love. He had kept it alive, and he was about to die. And the question he had been carrying to that spring for decades, the one that kept him awake at 3 in the morning during those last weeks, was whether what he had built would die with him or whether it would continue. It was not Vieux's job to keep it going. Vieux had done his 51 years of work. He had kept count on a piece of birch bark. It was my father's job, and mine, and Vieux's, to do what the three of us did in that hollow on October the 12th. We sat down on a flat rock in a forest none of us owned and agreed, without speaking, to keep this going. No other reason to do it except that we wanted to. That, I think, is what most love is, in the end. Whether it's between a husband and a wife, or a father and a son, or a man in Cadyville and an old hominid at a spring in the Five Ponds wilderness. It's deciding to stay together because together is better than alone, and to carry on after one of you is gone because what you built was bigger than any single life. My father, Armand Boudreau, died on October 16, 2019, in his own bed, 4 days after he saw his oldest friend for the last time. I had the privilege of driving him to that goodbye, and the heavier privilege of being asked to take what he was setting down. I have done my best. The bark is in my desk. The carved bone bird stayed at the spring. The friendship is 58 visits longer than it was when my father handed it to me. And on a good day, I think Armand would be glad. On a hard day, I drive west, 3 hours, with a thermos of coffee and a piece of whitefish in a cloth. And I sit on the rock my father sat on, and the old man with the silver in his hair and the careful hands comes down out of the timber to keep me company for a little while. And I am not alone in the woods, and neither is he. That's what we have. It's enough. It's more than enough. It was given to me by my father, and by a friend my father loved, and it is the best thing I have ever been given by anybody. And I will keep going down there as long as my legs will carry me. And after that, if I am lucky, my grandson will go. That is the part of the story I want you to know. There are old hominids at springs in the Five Ponds wilderness. I did drive my dying father 3 hours into the woods on a Saturday in October. But the part that matters is that my father, who never told me he loved me in those words because his French-Canadian father had never told him, drove 51 years' worth of love into a friendship most people would never understand. And at the end of his life, he handed it to me, and the handing was how he said the words. I have been listening to that sentence ever since.